My understanding is, as a church, you guys are going through the biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And rather than just jump in with the next message in the sequence, I asked DJ if I could just do maybe a bigger picture kind of deal. And maybe this message could help you as you're going through the biographies of Jesus, as you just to get a sense of kind of what motivated Jesus, what Jesus saw. You know, you can certainly look, but not see. You can listen, but not hear. My wife tells me that quite a bit. Say, honey, I'm listening. She goes, but you're not hearing me. So we can look and not see, and we can listen but not hear. I want us to take a little bit of time and get a sense of what Jesus saw. That's mostly what we're going to look at, but Jesus heard. If you were engaged with Jesus, you would walk away with maybe all kinds of different thoughts on what just happened, but you'd never walk away and say, I don't think I was heard. In fact, in one place in this chapter, Matthew chapter 9, the religious leaders, Jesus actually says that he saw what they were thinking. That's kind of scary, isn't it? And not only does Jesus see us accurately, he sees us completely. He sees what we're thinking. We only think we see what others are thinking, but he was accurate and understood completely. So this is a passage out of Matthew chapter 9, and this has been a passage that's always been a passage that has been very meaningful to me and very motivating to me, and actually has been a part of what I think is my life calling in terms of being a missionary and seeing new churches arise from, they didn't exist and now they do, kind of like Anthology, and often these new churches are made up and birthed with people that come to faith in Christ, and then they gather together, and God usually puts a person, a couple, family, other families together that sort of nurture this new church. So usually when I read this passage, those are the eyes that I see, those are the eyes that I read it through. But I discovered there was more as I read the entire chapter. One of the words that I saw over and over was Jesus saw. Jesus saw. And then as I would read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I saw it over and over and over again. So I tried to investigate it a little bit, and that's what we're going to do together. And as a result, I hope we'll have a better sense of, one, what Jesus saw, and then two, how we can see in the way that Jesus sees. And then finally, I want us to think a little bit about what it means to be seen by Jesus. I think that's something I missed in this passage for so long. I was always thinking about, okay, that's how Jesus saw people. I need to see people the same way. And I forgot about the first time I really felt and realized that Jesus saw me was back in October of 1972. So that'll just give you kind of a framework of where we're going. So let's read this passage, and if you'd like to read along with me, you can, right at the top of your listening guide. It says, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Now, along the lines of looking but not seeing, there are places here in LA where you can look out and you can, Griffith Park Observatory. Have you ever been up the Griffith Park Observatory? That's just an amazing perspective, right? Just a great vantage point Pasadena, Glendale, the San Bernardino Mountains. There's downtown LA, and sometimes when it's clear, you just, the contrast and the Christmas there of the skyline. It's just beautiful to see. And then if you look out towards the west, there's Century City, there's Westwood. You might even see Long Beach, and sometimes you can see the ocean, and it's just a great vantage point. And if you happen to be up there around sundown, is very interesting to watch the lights begin to come on in the valleys and downtown. But one thing from that vantage point, or when you're flying into LA at night, you see all the lines look straight, don't they? It just looks like this perfect grid. Everything looks kind of perfect. But if you're driving up towards the Sepulveda Pass on the 405, you see something very different. You see up close a mass of humanity, and it can be very overwhelming. It can be frustrating. Well, for me, it's almost always frustrating to drive the 405 and other freeways in LA at certain times of the day. I can look out from an airplane. I can look out from Griffith Park Observatory, and I can see, and I can say, oh, that's just so beautiful. But up close, sometimes the perspective is not the same. It says, Jesus saw. It was beyond just looking. It was beyond a cursory glance. Jesus was up on the mound there, and people were coming towards him. And he was looking out at the crowds. He saw the crowds. It was past the exterior. He saw into their minds, just like the religious leaders. He saw what they were thinking. He saw into their hearts. He saw completely. He saw accurately. And he saw with truth and grace. And we're going to really see this in one of the examples here in a few minutes. But it wasn't just, he went, oh gosh, you guys are so needy and I feel so bad for you. He sympathized. He understood. He saw with compassion. But he also saw accurately and completely, and he saw the people, he saw us, he sees us with truth. He really knows what's going on. It's impossible to pull the wool over God's eyes. So Jesus saw, he saw the needs. He understood, he knew their needs, their physical, emotional, relational, spiritual needs. He sympathized with their needs. But beyond the physical, beyond that, he saw their spiritual needs. And in fact, their spiritual needs very similar. He saw their spiritual blindness. He saw their spiritual thirst and hunger. He saw that they were lost. He saw the idols of their heart. And Jesus, as you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you just see over and over that Jesus was moved. Jesus had compassion, and it was stimulated by many different things, but here's a couple of things that you see over and over. Jesus was moved by the world's pain. Jesus was moved by the world's pain. Jesus was moved by the world's sorrow. He was moved by the hunger, by the loneliness, as he would see lonely people. Just think of the leper in Mark chapter 1. Very lonely, very isolated man. And this leper says to Jesus, he said, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. Now, Jesus could have just said, I want to do that. I will to make you clean. You're clean now. But notice Jesus reaches out and touches him. Jesus reached out and touched him, and he said, I am willing, be clean. Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. Jesus is moved by the loneliness of people, by the isolationism of people, by the bewildered people, by injustices. As you read through the Gospels, the biography of Jesus, you see those things over and over and over again. So Jesus saw, it wasn't just look, he really, really saw completely, accurately. So that's both comforting and discomforting, right? I mean, if Jesus sees me, he sees me. Jesus sees you completely. He sees what others don't see. He even sees what we don't see about ourselves. But he saw the crowds. And the crowds were made up of a wide assortment of people. You had the regular followers. They followed Jesus from town to town, from synagogue to synagogue. They were regulars. They were getting a pretty good picture of who Jesus was. They were regular, day in and day out. His disciples would be in that group. And then there would be a group of people that would be more the thrill seekers. They had heard about the miracles. You know, how he handed out Happy Meals to 5,000 people. And they thought, I'd like to see that. Or the healings, demons being cast out. They wanted to see Jesus do stuff. There were others that wanted to hear his teaching, and they wanted to hear more of it because it was astounding. In one place it says, after Jesus finished teaching, the people were amazed because he taught as one who had authority. And that was something that stood out to them. There were people that were needy, that were lonely. There were people that just wanted to be a part of the crowd. You know, they might even be introverts, but they could, you know, you can be all by yourself in a crowd. You know, sometimes you just like go out to the Santa Monica Pier and you can be lonely by yourself, but you're just doing it with a crowd of people. And then there were those that were actually traveling around to watch him, to criticize him, and to find fault with what he was doing. They were jealous of the gathering crowd. They were jealous of the people that were astounded by his teaching. And you had religious leaders, primarily that we know about, who would follow Jesus to criticize. So the crowd had lots of different people. Imagine who you would be in that crowd. You know, forget everything you know and just say, okay, if I were there, I would have probably been like the religious leaders, or I would have been the thrill seeker, or I would have been just amazed at someone that could teach and someone who seemed to care that much. So Jesus saw the crowds and he had compassion on them. Now, I can look at people and have compassion, but just like looking and seeing, hearing and listening, there's compassion and there's compassion. And when Matthew records that Jesus had compassion on the crowds, I just want to try to help us understand how what that meant, that kind of compassion. It was his heart was stirred. It was, if you've ever kind of felt something in your gut, maybe you're waiting some news, you're going to get a call from the doctor, you have an appointment, your boss wants to see you in a relationship situation, someone says, hey, we need to talk, and you get that feeling in your gut. It's a very similar feeling Jesus had here. It was at a gut level. It was an intense compassion. He was moved to the depth of his feeling, his heart, his emotions. His heart was broken. He had pity. There was sympathy. There was sorrow. And it was the kind of compassion that didn't stop there, but it was moved to action. His compassion moved him to action. It was more than just identifying with people. Jesus, there was a sense of you were suffering with someone that you have compassion on. Jesus was suffering with the crowd. And it was this merciful kindness. It's the feeling that I get if I'm going to do a roller coaster. It's just amazing. Sometimes you get news or you're anticipating something and it affects your digestive system. That's the picture here. It wasn't just looking out and going, the crowd today. I have compassion. They're harassed. They're helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. No, he was moved by the people. It says, Jesus saw the crowds and had compassion because they were harassed and helpless. And I just made a list here. That's why I wanted you to have a listening guide, because if I start reading this, you're just going to maybe fade out. But read this list along here with me, just kind of as you're reading along. And this is based on different translations of the passage. You know, you have the New International Version, the ESV, the NLT. There's lots of different translations, so sometimes they just nuance the word a little bit different here. But when you put them all together, you get this composite of what this harassed and helpless was. Confused, distressed, dispirited, bewildered, troubled, worried, exhausted, faint, scattered abroad, aimless, hurting, cast aside, downcast, fatigued, forlorn, dejected, deserted. That covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? That probably encompassed the entire crowd. That's what he was looking at. And it wasn't just how they were doing that day or in that moment. Maybe John and Mary got into an argument on the way to hear Jesus, so they were kind of frustrated. This is more a picture of a habitual condition. It wasn't just their immediate situation, it was really inside out. That's what he saw, harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And what he's doing here is he's taken an image, a metaphor that they would understand in that culture. I don't know if any of you own sheep or have ever worked as a shepherd. I've not. And most people I know, when I lived in Vermont, I actually met a few that had sheep and actually took care of their sheep. But he's painting a picture here of the religious leaders, so it must have been very uncomfortable for the religious leaders because they were the ones that were supposed to be the shepherds of the people. And Jesus is saying that the people that were harassed and helpless were like sheep without a shepherd. They were torn and thrown down. Sheep are very vulnerable. They're when they're exposed to certain weather conditions, when they're exposed to predator animals, when they do not have a leader, eventually it's like all four legs just go out and they just become prostrate. They don't problem solve very well. A sheep doesn't go, okay, I'm going to take charge now. We don't have a shepherd, so I'm gonna lead our group. No one really stands out in a group of sheep like that. They lacked adequate leadership, and this was a harsh rebuke to the religious leaders that were criticizing and watching and taking notes that day. They were distressed to the point of just giving up. That was a snapshot of the crowd that Jesus had compassion on that day. Jesus saw it all. He saw the struggles, the heartaches, the hopes, the dreams, the longings, the fears, the family situations, the relationships. He saw everything. He saw the crowd, but he saw individuals. And that's really hard to do, right? From Griffith Park or the inside seat on the airplane, you can kind of see the crowds, but you don't see individuals. Jesus saw the crowds, but he saw the individuals. And I want us to look at a couple. Mother Teresa made a statement one time, and I put it on your listening guide. She was asked many, many times, but on one occasion she was asked, how in the world do you do what you do? Here in Calcutta, India, crowds of people, enormous crowds, people that are harassed, people that are helpless, people like sheep without a shepherd and with incredible need, impoverished people, physically, mentally. And Mother Teresa's response is so classic. She says, I don't see the crowds. I see individuals. Jesus was aware of the crowds, but Jesus could not see the individuals. A couple of examples that I want to look at. And if you have a Bible, you can turn to them, but we're not going to look at all of these. But I want to look at this. We don't even know her name, other than the woman with the blood disorder. And there's a couple of, this story, this engagement, this interaction with Jesus is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But I'm going to look at the Mark chapter 5 one. And if you want, some of these are just easy if you just listen and kind of gather the story there. So I'm going to read out of Mark. But when you put the three accounts together, you get a fuller picture. But I love this one in Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 24. It says, a large crowd followed and pressed around Jesus. Jesus was going with Jairus, whose daughter was dying. And the crowd's thick, and as the crowd often was around Jesus, and Jesus began to move with Jairus, and then something happened. As the large crowd followed and pressed in around Jesus, a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Here's Jesus looking. The disciples answered, "Jesus, you see the people crowding against you, and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Do you think the woman was getting a little uncomfortable? Do you think she wanted to be seen? She was healed, and Jesus is looking. Do you think Jesus was trying to figure it out? I think he knew. It says, "Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.'" Now, I'm going to look at it in Matthew just for a second, because again, you get a little bit fuller picture when you look at a couple of the different accounts. And Matthew 9 is the chapter in which our verses today, our passages today. Starting in Matthew 9, 22, or just before that. Again, he's going with Jairus. And it says, "Just then, in verse 20, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said to herself, 'If only I touch his cloak, I will be healed.'" Here it is. Jesus turned and saw her. It wasn't just Jesus was looking around, so she puts her hands up and goes, "I am the one." My guess is, when it says Jesus looked around, he looked and stopped and looked right at her. Can you imagine that? Jesus, that's doing all this stuff, everyone's crowding around. He's on a mission to go to Jairus' house because his daughter's dying. And all you were wanting to do was get close to him. You didn't want to bother him. He just thought, if I could just touch the garment. It's been 12 years. You've spent everything you have, and you've only gotten worse. And you don't know this for certain, but you reach out. And then it all stops. Jesus starts looking around, and probably got real quiet. And then he looks at her. I just love that. Jesus looked and saw her. Jesus saw the crowds and had compassion. Jesus saw this woman among the crowd. He saw her. And he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has healed you." That's powerful, isn't it? You know, to be seen by Jesus, to experience his compassion, to be known completely, to be essentially exposed for who I really am, and to be seen by Jesus is both frightening and at the same time incredibly comforting and enticing. If he could see me for who I really, really am and have compassion on me, I want to be seen by him. Another one, Zacchaeus. Maybe when you were young, if you went to Bible school or something like that, there was a song about Zacchaeus. He was a wee little man, and it conjured up all kinds of pictures in my mind. But Luke chapter 19, we encounter Zacchaeus. And we encounter Jesus and Zacchaeus. Luke 19, starting verse 1, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. If you were a chief tax collector, it meant you were probably very wealthy, and it also meant you were probably not liked. Think IRS times 100, okay? They were very unliked in that time, in that place. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. I also think there might be a hint that he didn't want Jesus to necessarily see him. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And Jesus wasn't, walking in a quiet kind of way. Crowds around Jesus. He always drew crowds of people, especially at this point in his life. When Jesus reached the spot, now I know Jesus is God, he knows everything, all of that, but isn't this kind of ironic? I'm sure I'm not using ironic in the right way, but I would say, loosely, it's kind of ironic. He climbs up the tree, probably doesn't want to be seen, but he wants to see Jesus. It says when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus. Maybe Jesus made up that song at that point. Probably not. Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Again, probably some fear, but something about the way Jesus looked at him. Jesus looked up. He was hiding. He was positioning himself so he could see, but not necessarily be seen. And Jesus looks up. And then something remarkable happened at Zacchaeus' house. I don't know how long they were in there. I don't know what all they talked about. But at the end of that interaction, Zacchaeus was very different. He says, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, he probably had, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, Zacchaeus, today salvation has come to this house. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost. Zacchaeus was lost. And Jesus, when he got to that spot, looked up, and there was Zacchaeus. And there's more, but let's look at just one more here. The rich young ruler. He goes by a lot of titles in the different accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But let's look at Mark chapter 10, starting in verse 17. This is the one I mentioned earlier that Jesus saw with compassion, he saw with grace. But Jesus' grace, Jesus' compassion is always with truth. It's accurate. It's complete. Jesus, full of grace. We like that. Jesus, full of truth. Don't always like that so much. But you can't separate. It's not 50% grace, 50% truth. He saw the people with 100% truth, 100% grace. He sees us, 100% truth, 100% grace. Mark chapter 10, starting in verse 17. It says, as Jesus started on his way, a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. He was eager to see Jesus. He said, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus answered, why? Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not give false testimony. Do not defraud. Honor your father and mother. And maybe as Jesus was reciting those, he wanted to interrupt. And he says, teacher, all these I have kept since I was a boy. It's like you're giving a quiz and you get them all right and you're excited about it. You're like, yeah, aced that. And then this is powerful right here. Verse 21. Jesus looked at him and loved him. Jesus knows everything. But before Jesus spoke, I just love that Mark recorded this. He looked at him and loved him. He had compassion on him. And then Jesus said, one thing you lack. Go, sell everything you have, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me. Jesus sees the idols of our heart. He sees that thing or those things that would prevent us from following him. And then here, one of those tragic verses in the Bible, verse 22, at this, the man's face fell. Isn't that just a powerful description? Have you ever seen someone's face fall? I see that a lot of times with my daughters. You know, when they're disappointed or just something and their face falls. Some translations say he was very sad, but I just think the picture of his face fell. And he went away sad because he had great wealth. Jesus didn't just see the people and have compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus engaged the people. Jesus went to the people. He listened, he engaged, he heard, he saw, he entered their daily lives. Knowing isn't just a supernatural phenomena. You know, you and I can really know each other if we really see, if we really hear. There's a lot of cues, there's a lot of clues that can help us understand what's going on with one another. I mean, you can, I guess in one respect, you can just take the posture of, you see the crowds, but you don't see the people. You just don't see. You just go through life. You don't see. Some people see, or sometimes people see, and they don't like what they see. On the 405, I don't like what I see. On the 101, I don't like what I see. On the 5, I don't like. There's a lot of places that I see, but I don't like what I see. Some people can see and feel bad, but as soon as they don't see anymore, or they've passed that situation, and they might even think someone should do something. Have you ever said that? I say that. Someone should really do something, but then I get past it, and what I tend to do is I forget. And then sometimes people see, and they are compelled to act out of compassion. And sometimes I don't have a watch, so I have no idea. My watch battery died. Are we okay? How much more? 5 minutes? Okay. It's 12:30? What? All right, so I'm going to move on to the second page, okay? And this will be a clue right here that we're going to rapidly move through this part. Common eye problems, okay? The most common eye problem for me is I. The letter I. I tend to be narrow, self-focused, and self-oriented. But my brother-in-law is an optometrist, and I don't really know anything about optometry, but I do know that there's some common eye problems. Lazy eye, nearsighted, farsighted, dry eye, presbyopia. That's where you turn 40 and either your arms start to grow or you get glasses. One of the great arguments against evolution. My arms would be really, really long right now. And there'd be a corresponding. Either you see people far away, but you can't see people up close, your family, your neighbors, but you're concerned about those out there, or you're only concerned about your little kind of tribe or your situation, but you don't see beyond that. Or lazy eye, you just don't want to see it. Dry eye, your compassion begins to dry up, and all kinds of things, but you can play around with those. But one of the things I want to point out here, before we can see like Jesus, most often seeing comes before compassion. You might say, I love everybody. But if you see somebody and compassion happens, then you do love that person, and maybe you love more persons, and maybe you do love everybody. But seeing, you've got to see and not just look. You got to hear, not just listen. You got to walk away from the observatory, get off the airplane, and get on the 405 or the Santa Monica Pier. You need to see people. Until you see people, I don't think you'll have compassion. John Steinbeck, Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck, he said, I wonder how many people I've looked at all my life and never seen. Frederick Buechner, a great writer, he lives in southern Vermont. I used to want to visit his house when I lived there, but I didn't think he didn't know who I was. So he said, if we're to love our neighbors before doing anything else, we must see our neighbors with our imagination as well as our eyes. That is to say, like artists. We must not just see their faces, but the life behind and within their faces. And then one more quote here. A lady named Alexandra Horowitz, who lives in New York City, she wrote a book called On Looking, 11 Walks with Expert Eyes. She had a geologist. She had a landscape designer. She had all kinds of different professionals walk with her through her neighborhood because she really wanted to see her neighborhood. She really wanted to understand her neighborhood. And here's what she said. We see, but we do not see. We use our eyes, but our gaze is glancing frivolously, considering this object. We see the signs, but not their meanings. We are not blinded, but we have blinders. And then she summarized her experience saying, we choose not to see. We restrict our field of vision to the electronic device in front of us, and we warily retrace our usual steps from point A to point B, to the point where we don't really see anything around us. Now, I want us to think for a second here. I asked you at the beginning to imagine yourself in the crowd that day, one of the crowd. Imagine Jesus seeing you. Now, if they're seeing about the woman with the blood disorder, Zacchaeus, and other stories where there's the leper, you're thinking, that could be okay. But then you think about the rich young ruler, and you're like, I don't know if I don't know if I want him to see me or not, if he sees me completely and accurately. Never forget that Jesus saw, as we read today, but never forget that Jesus sees and that Jesus had compassion and Jesus has compassion. One of the most beautiful stories in the Bible is the prodigal son. You get the two sons, you get the father, and a lot you can understand and learn there. But one thing that's just mind-blowing to me, this disrespectful, liberated, self-indulging young man decides to come back home. And it says that his father, picture of God, saw him when he was far away and ran to him. His father saw him. Wasn't just looking, but he saw him and ran toward him. True seeing can only happen when we've been seen. Jesus said in Luke chapter 7, therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. John is an old man, one of Jesus' disciples, late in his life, a fiery young man. But as an older man, he said, we love because he first loved us. We see because he first saw us. And he didn't just see me back in October of 1972. He sees me today. If you've ever been seen by Jesus, and beyond seen, but that relationship has begun, you've appropriated his grace, you've asked for forgiveness, you've acknowledged him as the leader of your life, then you were seen. But don't ever forget, and I say that not to sound like but I tend to forget. So I want to remind others. Don't forget, he sees you today. He saw me in October 1972, and he sees me right now. And he looks on us with compassion. He sees us as harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. Jesus said, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. See one another Love one another. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for your truth, the scriptures, the Bible, that you reveal yourself to us. We can know you. We don't understand everything. We certainly don't know everything. But what you reveal is just almost mind-blowing. And you see us in whatever state, whatever condition we're in. And God, maybe we've never ever been seen by you or realized that you're looking at us. And maybe that's our starting point. Or maybe we've been following you for many, many, many years. And I'd put myself in that category. And sometimes I forget. And sometimes if I'm really honest, I don't want you to see me. I know that's impossible, but I'd say, I'd rather you not really be looking right now, but you do see. And you see completely. So God, as we get ready to sing, Lord, I pray that acknowledging that you know everything about us when you see us, that we would honestly look to you, and we would, with awareness that you see everything, that we would be honest with you when we sing to you, when we speak to you. And as we experience your love, your mercy, your truth, your compassion, your grace, your forgiveness, all those things. And we know that not only have we been seen, but you see us with compassion. That, God, may we begin to see one another that way. In Jesus' name.